The night I left, it was raining so hard the windshield looked like a curtain of silver tears, and my husband was still standing in the doorway screaming my name like I was a thief. I had 2 suitcases in the trunk, 2 children half asleep in the back seat, and a cardboard box on the floor with the only things in that house that truly belonged to me. My birth certificates, my old journal, and a folder of papers that would change everything. My son, Caleb, was 7. My daughter, Ellie, was 4. Caleb kept asking in a small voice if we were going on a trip. Ellie had one thumb in her mouth and her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin. I told them yes, we were going to stay somewhere else for a little while, and I smiled so they would not see how badly my hands were shaking. Behind us, inside that huge house with its marble floors and perfect imported furniture, my mother-in-law was saying, "Let her go. She has nothing without this family." That sentence should have broken me. Instead, it woke me up, because by then I had already learned something terrible about rich families that smile for the neighbors and poison your life behind closed doors. They do not always protect what they own. Sometimes they destroy it, and I was done letting them destroy me. I wish I could say I left because of one dramatic moment, one screaming match, one clear and simple betrayal. But the truth is, betrayal had been growing in that house for years, tucked into polite dinners, fake hugs, hidden bank statements, and little comments that sounded harmless until they piled up like stones on your chest. When I met Daniel, I thought I had won the kind of love that people write songs about. He was charming, in a calm, steady way, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and held doors open and looked at you like the rest of the room had gone blurry. I was 25, working as a preschool teacher in Columbus, Ohio, and trying to build a life that felt like mine. Daniel was already from another world. His family owned Whitmore Construction, a company with their name on office buildings, apartment renovations, and half the luxury townhomes in the county. He didn't act like a spoiled rich guy when I first met him. He acted grounded. He talked about wanting a simple life, wanting kids, wanting a wife who would be his partner. I fell for all of it. When he proposed on a dock at the lake where his grandmother lived, I cried so hard I could barely answer him. His grandmother, Edith, was the only person in that family who ever made me feel like I was more than a decoration. She was sharp-eyed, soft-spoken, and impossible to fool. She smelled like lavender and old books. She watched Daniel with a kind of quiet disappointment that only grandmothers can manage. Then she took my hand and said, "You have kind eyes, Mara. Don't let anyone teach you to doubt them." I did not understand what she meant then. I understood later. After we married, Daniel asked me to stay home when our first baby arrived. He said it would be easier, safer, better for the children. His mother, Denise, said a good wife knew how to make a home run smoothly. She said it with a smile, but her eyes always felt cold. So I left my job. I told myself it was temporary, just until things settled down, just until the babies were older, just until Daniel's work schedule got less demanding. But time does not pause for the promises people make at the beginning of a marriage. It only reveals whether those promises were real. By the time Caleb was 5 and Ellie was nearly 2, I had become invisible in that house. I cooked. I cleaned. I packed lunches with little notes in them. I sat through school programs alone because Daniel was stuck at the office, even when I knew he had walked in smelling like expensive cologne that did not belong to me. I smiled at family gatherings while Denise introduced me like I was a pleasant addition rather than a person. "This is Mara," she would say to guests. "Our little helper." Helper. Not daughter-in-law. Not mother of the grandchildren. Just helper. And Daniel never corrected her. His younger sister, Brooke, was worse in a different way. She was the kind of woman who could make a cruel remark sound like a compliment. At Christmas one year, after I had spent 12 hours cooking and setting up a perfect dinner, she looked around the table and laughed. "Wow, Mara, you're surprisingly good at this. I thought teachers were all chaos and crayons." I laughed too, because that is what women like me do when we are trying to survive a room. Edith, Daniel's grandmother, was the only one who saw it. She was frail by then, but not weak. Her mind was faster than anybody else's in the family. When the others were loud, she watched. When they spoke over me, she waited until they ran out of breath, then asked me direct questions no one else cared to ask. How are the children sleeping? Are you eating enough? Does Daniel still listen when you speak? I should have known then she was asking for a reason. One afternoon, about 8 months before I left, she called me to her room after everyone else had gone out. She was sitting by the window with a blanket over her knees, a stack of papers beside her, and the light from the lamp making her face look almost golden. Close the door, Mara. I did. She tapped the papers with her fingers. Do you know what this family does when it wants something? I gave her a nervous smile. Gets it? She gave a small, tired laugh. No. It convinces itself it deserves it first. I sat down slowly in the chair beside her bed. I'm old, she said. That means I've watched people long enough to know when they're smiling and when they're calculating. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. Daniel has been asking me about my accounts. I felt my stomach tighten. Why would he do that? Because he thinks I don't notice. Her eyes sharpened. Because he thinks being old means being blind. She reached for my hand. Listen to me carefully. If anyone in this family ever asks you to sign something that looks routine, harmless, temporary, or just for convenience, you bring it to someone outside this house before you put your name on it. I stared at her. Then she said something I will never forget. People do not always betray you with loud drama. Sometimes they betray you with paperwork. I laughed softly then, because it sounded almost too specific to be real. I had no idea how dangerous those words would become. 2 months later, Edith died in her sleep. The whole family acted devastated in public. There were flowers, speeches, polished grief. Daniel cried at the funeral, though I could not tell whether it was for her or for himself. Denise wore black like she was starring in a play. Brooke posted a photo of herself, holding a tissue to her face with the caption, "A hard day for our family." But after the funeral, the atmosphere in the house changed so fast it nearly gave me whiplash. It started with small things. Daniel began taking calls outside. Denise began speaking to me in that sugary voice people use when they think you are too simple to challenge them. Mara, darling, could you handle the pantry inventory? Mara, sweetie, we need you to watch the children this weekend while we meet with the attorney. Then came the paperwork. Daniel brought home a folder one Thursday night and set it on the kitchen island while I was making dinner. He kissed the top of Ellie's head, then turned to me as if he were asking whether we needed more milk. It's just some estate housekeeping, he said. Mom wants things updated. Insurance, taxes, household transfers. Nothing major. I wiped my hands on a towel and glanced at the papers. They looked dense and official. My old instincts told me not to touch them. What exactly am I signing? Daniel smiled that patient smile men wear when they want you to stop asking questions. Routine stuff. Edith left some things unclear. It all needs to be cleaned up before the attorney files anything final. Denise, who had wandered into the kitchen at the same moment, added, Honestly, Mara, it's just easier if everyone cooperates. I looked at the papers again. There were pages and pages of legal language. I had been out of work for years, and they knew it. They knew words like that made me feel small. I'd like to have the attorney explain it first. Denise's face changed so quickly anyone else might have missed it. You don't trust your own family? I almost laughed at that, because it was such a ridiculous sentence. But in that house, ridiculous sentences were used like knives. Daniel set his jaw. Come on, Mara. Don't make this weird. You think I'd ask you to sign something that hurts you? I looked at him and saw, for the first time, that he was not asking. He was testing. So I did what Edith had warned me to do. I said, No, I'll wait. The room went very quiet. Daniel slid the folder back toward himself. Fine, he said too calmly. We'll deal with it later. But from that night on, things got worse. Money began disappearing from our joint account in amounts small enough to seem harmless, but large enough to add up fast. A school tuition payment I expected to see delayed. A grocery account transferred. A reimbursement missing. When I asked Daniel about it, he said there had been a temporary business issue. When I asked again, he looked annoyed. You don't need to track every dollar, Mara. That was funny, because suddenly I was the only one in that house who did care where every dollar went. Then, one afternoon, I found a bank statement folded inside a junk mail envelope on the counter. It was not for our joint account. It was for a business account in Daniel's name, and in the previous month alone, he had moved more than $80,000 to an offshore consulting entity I had never heard of. I stared at the paper until the numbers blurred. When he came home that evening, I asked him directly. He barely looked up from his phone. "It's business." "What business?" "Just business." $80,000 is not just business, Daniel. He finally raised his eyes to mine. "Are you trying to accuse me of something?" His tone was so cold it frightened me. I held the paper up. "What is this?" He took it from my hand, glanced at it, and laughed once, like I was being naive. "You read too much into things. The company shifts funds all the time." "Without telling me? You're not on the board." I actually felt my face burn. "I'm your wife." He shrugged. "That doesn't make you a banker." That was the first time I slept in the guest room. The second time came 3 nights later, when I overheard Denise and Brooke in the hallway after midnight. I had gotten up because Ellie had a fever, and I was searching for her medicine. Their voices drifted around the corner, low and sharp. Denise said, "If she won't sign, we can't keep dragging this out." Brooke replied, "Then make her sign. Daniel's already covered enough to get the transition moving. What about the children?" There was a pause. Then Denise said, in a voice so cool it still chills me now, "If Mara leaves, she leaves with the children. We can replace her. We cannot replace the arrangement." I froze with the medicine in my hand. Brooke sighed. "Daniel says she's too emotional to understand the structure of the estate. Maybe we should just tell her the new trust depends on her cooperation." "My son should never have married someone who thinks questions are opinions," Denise snapped. I backed away before they could hear me breathing. That was the moment I knew I was not living in a family home anymore. I was trapped in a chess game, and I had only just realized I was one of the pieces. The next day I searched the house. I was careful, because I knew if I was caught it would become a fight I was not ready for. I checked Daniel's office first. The drawers were locked, but the desk had a small, hidden compartment behind a false panel. I know because Edith once showed me how old houses had tricks like that. Not this house. The office had one, too. Inside was a second folder with my name on it. My heart pounded so loudly I had to sit down. I found a copy of a deed for the lake property Edith had loved, the one where she had spent every summer for 40 years. I found an unsigned transfer form with my signature already typed in the blank. I found a bank document showing the family had taken out a home equity line of credit using our house as collateral. And at the bottom of the stack, I found a note in Daniel's handwriting. "Need her clean on paper before the trust amendment is filed. Without Mara, there's no objection. Without Mara, there are some sentences that do not just hurt you. They strip the air out of the room." I sat there in Daniel's office with my legs numb and the papers shaking in my hands, trying to understand what I was seeing. They had not been treating me like family. They had been preparing to erase me. I did not confront him that night. I did not scream, throw the papers, or demand explanations like people do in movies. I went upstairs, sat on the bathroom floor beside the tub, and cried so quietly I could barely hear myself. Then Ellie came in and wrapped her tiny arms around my neck. "Mommy, why are you sad?" I looked at my daughter in that moment and realized something simple and brutal. If I stayed, I would teach my children that being humiliated was normal, that losing yourself was love, that family meant enduring whatever was done to you as long as the house looked nice from the outside. I could not do that to them, so I started preparing. I copied every document I could. I photographed every statement. I saved voicemails, texts, emails. I moved a little cash from our grocery envelope each week and hid it in an old makeup bag. I called the one person I trusted from my college years, my friend Talia, who lived 2 towns over and still answered the phone no matter the hour. I told her I might need a place for a while, and she did not ask enough questions to make me feel cornered. She simply said, "I've got a couch, a spare room, and a lock on the door." I wanted to cry again, but this time from relief. The real break came the following Monday. Daniel came home late, drunk enough that his tie was loose and his patience was gone. Denise was already in the kitchen. Brooke had come by with a man from a law firm, and they were all talking in low, fast voices. I was standing in the hallway with a load of laundry when I heard Brooke say, "She's not stable enough to push back if we move tonight." Daniel answered, She doesn't have a choice. My hand tightened on the basket. Denise said, "Then let's be done with it. If she refuses to sign, she can leave with what she came with." I stepped into the kitchen before I could talk myself out of it. Silence fell over the room so hard it felt staged. "What am I signing?" I asked. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "You were listening." "Yes," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I was." Brooke gave me a fake little smile. "Mara, you're making this more dramatic than it needs to be. It's simply a restructuring of assets. And my name appears on... What, exactly?" Daniel set his glass down too hard. "Why are you doing this now?" "Because I'm done pretending I don't notice when my husband and his family hide documents from me." His face flushed. "You have no idea what's going on." "No?" I pulled the folder from the laundry basket where I had hidden it and set it on the counter. "Then explain the loan against our house. Explain the offshore transfers. Explain why there's a typed signature with my name on it." Brooke's expression changed first. Not panic. Calculation. Denise took a slow breath. "Where did you get that?" "From your son's desk." Daniel stared at me like he had never seen me before. For one strange second, I felt powerful. Not because they were afraid, but because they were finally caught off guard. Then Daniel did what cruel people do when they are cornered. He laughed. Not a real laugh. A dismissive one. "You think this changes anything?" I said nothing. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You have nowhere to go, Mara. No job, no savings, no home in your name. Don't embarrass yourself." There it was. The truth, finally spoken aloud. I looked past him at my children's drawings on the refrigerator, then at the polished counters, then at the family portrait on the wall that had always looked a little too staged to be real. "No," I said quietly. "I think you're the one who's embarrassed." That evening, while Daniel was in the shower and Denise was on the phone, I called Talia. My voice barely held together as I asked if she could come get us. She did not ask questions. She just said, "Pack the children's essentials. I'm on my way." I moved like I was inside someone else's body after that. 2 suitcases, 2 children's clothes, a box of documents, my laptop, Ellie's favorite blanket, Caleb's asthma inhaler, the little ceramic mug Edith had given me years ago that said, "Read more, fearless." When Caleb asked why we were packing, I told him the truth I could manage. Because sometimes grown-ups need to live somewhere safer. He looked at me with the serious expression only children can have. "Is Dad not safe?" I almost answered too quickly. I almost said too much. Instead, I kissed his forehead and said, "Right now, Mommy is making sure we are." Talia arrived at the side gate, in a gray sedan, with the engine running. I remember the sound of rain on the driveway. I remember Ellie's sleepy weight on my shoulder. I remember standing at the front door for one last second, looking back at the house where I had spent years trying to become smaller so everyone else could feel bigger. Then Daniel burst out of the kitchen and saw the suitcases. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice hit the foyer like a slap. Denise came behind him, face tight with fury. "Mara, you are not leaving with those children." I met her eyes. "Watch me." Daniel took a step toward me. "You are overreacting. Put the bags down." "No, you are being irrational." I laughed, and this time it sounded broken. "No, Daniel, I am being done." He stared at me as if I had started speaking another language. Then Denise said the sentence that burned itself into my memory forever. "If you walk out that door, do not expect anything from this family." I looked at her, then at my children, then back at the man who had once promised me safety. "Good," I said, "because I stopped expecting it a long time ago." We left before they could stop us. I thought the worst part would be driving away. It wasn't. The worst part was hearing Caleb ask from the back seat, after we had gone several miles in silence, "Are they going to come get us?" I glanced at him in the rear-view mirror and saw fear trying very hard to disguise itself as bravery. "No," I said. "Not unless a judge says they can." He nodded. "Because children understand the word judge better than they understand betrayal." Talia brought us to her apartment first. It was small and cluttered and smelled faintly like coffee and laundry soap, and it felt more like home than that giant house ever had. She gave the children cereal at midnight, found clean pajamas for Ellie, and made me sit down before I collapsed. I slept for 3 hours, When I woke up, I had 17 missed calls from Daniel, 9 from Denise, and 1 voicemail from a number I did not recognize. The message was from a man named Harold Finch, an attorney who said he had represented Edith Whitmore for years and needed to speak to me immediately regarding a sealed amendment to her estate documents. I almost ignored it. After everything, I was suspicious of everyone. But Edith's name made me call back. Harold's office was downtown, on the 3rd floor of an old brick building with a fading brass sign. He was an older man with kind eyes and a voice like rough paper. He asked me to come in without the children. Talia watched them while I drove over with my stomach so tight it hurt. The moment I sat down, Harold opened a slim black folder and slid it toward me. "I'm sorry for the circumstances," he said. "But your mother-in-law anticipated there might be trouble." I blinked. "I don't understand." He folded his hands. "Edith changed her estate plan 7 months before she died. She specifically requested that certain information be withheld until after the family attempted to finalize the transfer they thought they controlled." My mouth went dry. He opened the folder and showed me a letter in Edith's handwriting. "Mara," it began, "if you are reading this, it means they did what I feared they would do. You were right to distrust the paperwork." My hands started shaking so hard Harold waited until I could hold the page. The letter went on to explain that Edith had not only seen the family's financial games, but had quietly hired an auditor months before her death. She had suspected Daniel and Denise were moving funds through the company accounts and using her age as an excuse to isolate her from the numbers. She had also discovered the false signature on the deed transfer attempt. Then came the part that nearly made me stop breathing. Edith had left the lake cottage, the only property in the family that had never been leveraged, directly into a trust for my children and me. Not Daniel, not Denise, not Brooke, me. Her letter said, "I watched the way you cared for this family when no one cared for you. That is not weakness. That is character. And character deserves protection." I had to set the page down because I could not see through the tears. Harold gave me a moment before continuing. "There is more." He told me Daniel had quietly borrowed against the house, using forged authorization documents tied to our joint account. He told me the company had begun showing irregular transfers that would likely trigger a full audit now that Edith's private accountant had released his notes. He told me that once the trust was activated, the family could no longer touch the cottage, and any attempt to challenge the amendment would expose the documents Daniel and Denise had already tried to hide. I laughed through tears, because the irony was so sharp it almost felt like mercy. Edith had spent her final months quietly building a trap around the people who thought age made her harmless. I asked Harold one question. Did she know I was going to leave? He smiled sadly. She wrote, "Mara will not stay where she is treated like a transaction." I sat there in that office with her letter in my hands and felt something in me crack open. Not from pain this time, but from grief mixed with gratitude so intense it was almost holy. I had loved that woman, and she had loved me enough to leave a door open. The legal fight that followed was brutal, but not in the dramatic way movies make it. It was brutal in the quiet, exhausting way that real justice often is. There were hearings, statements, frozen accounts, lawyers speaking over one another. Daniel, showing up in expensive suits like money, could still save him. Denise calling me manipulative with a smile that no longer worked. Brooke suddenly looking pale whenever financial records were mentioned. The first time Daniel saw the trust documents, his face went blank. The second time he saw the auditor's report, he looked angry. The third time, when the bank flagged the forged signatures and the home equity loan was officially under review, he stopped looking at me and started looking at the floor. I sat across from him in a conference room while Harold laid out the evidence in plain terms. The house loan, the diverted funds, the false signatures, the timing of the transfers. The message chain between Daniel and Brooke discussing how to clean the files before the amendment was filed. Daniel tried to speak over the facts. Harold did not let him. At one point Daniel turned to me, eyes red, voice low and urgent. "Mara, this doesn't have to ruin everything. We can work through this." I stared at him for a long second. "You already ruined it." He flinched as if I had struck him. Denise jumped in then, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. You are making this worse for your children. I let out a breath and almost smiled, because that was the mistake people like her always made. They assumed fear still worked on the person they had already pushed too far. No, I said. You made it worse for my children when you started using them as leverage. Brooke crossed her arms. That is an ugly accusation. I looked at her and said, You helped forge my name. The room went silent. She did not deny it. That told me everything. There is a strange kind of power in finally hearing the lie stop pretending to be true. The court later confirmed what Edith had suspected. The home equity line had been opened with paperwork that could not withstand scrutiny. Several transfers from the company accounts were flagged. At least one consultant agreement Daniel had used to justify moving money was built on false invoices. The family tried to fight it, then tried to negotiate, then tried to blame misunderstanding, but the facts did not care about their manners. The consequences came slowly, then all at once. The bank froze the accounts. The company board removed Daniel from executive control pending review. The loan against the house forced the sale of assets the family had always treated like they were permanent. Brooke's husband left her after the financial mess touched his own name. Denise, who had spent so many years acting like the queen of that house, had to move into a smaller condo she could not afford without selling half her jewelry. And Daniel? Daniel lost the thing he loved most, the illusion that he was untouchable. He tried once, in a last meeting, to tell me he still loved me. I looked at him for a moment and realized I did not feel rage anymore. Rage is still a kind of connection. What I felt was deeper and quieter. Nothing. I don't hate you, I said. That would mean you still had access to my life. His jaw tightened. You are being cruel. No, I said. Cruel would have been staying. That was the end of it. Not the legal end. That took months. But the emotional end happened in that room, with the rain tapping softly against the windows and my life finally no longer sitting under his control. After the dust began to settle, Harold met me at the cottage on the lake with the final trust paperwork. The place was smaller than the house I had left, but it was beautiful in a way that did not need to impress anyone. The porch looked out over water that changed color with the sky. The rooms smelled like cedar and old sunlight. Edith had always said the cottage was the only place in the family where people remembered how to tell the truth. I opened the door with Caleb and Ellie beside me, and both children ran from room to room like they had been waiting their whole lives for walls that felt kind. Caleb stopped in the living room and said, Mom, it's quiet here. I knelt beside him. Do you like that? He nodded. It feels safe. I had to look away for a second because my throat closed up. That summer, I did not rebuild my old life. I built a new one. I used part of the trust and the settlement to open a small learning space for children in the neighborhood. Nothing grand, just a warm, sunlit place where parents could bring their kids for tutoring, reading circles, and after-school care. I named it Edith's Cottage Learning Room because I wanted her name to mean something soft and useful and lasting. Talia helped with the walls. My former coworker, Jenna, came in on weekends. A retired teacher down the street donated books. Every shelf felt like a tiny act of revenge against the years I had been made to feel disposable. As for Daniel's family, they were forced to live with the reality they had spent so long ignoring. You cannot build a kingdom on lies and expect the foundation to stay standing forever. People in town noticed, of course. They always do. A family that loud cannot fall quietly. At first, I thought I wanted everyone to know exactly what they had done to me. I wanted them exposed, humiliated, reduced to the size they had tried to make me feel. But the truth is, when the court papers were finally filed and the accounts were frozen and the house was sold, I did not feel triumphant. I felt free. There is a difference. Triumph is noisy. Freedom is calm. One afternoon, about 6 months after we left, Caleb and Ellie were sitting on the porch steps at the cottage eating popsicles while I sorted books for the learning room. A breeze moved over the water, and the sound of their laughter drifted through the screen door. Caleb looked up at me and said, Mom? Yeah, baby? He studied me for a second, serious as ever. Are you glad we left? I thought about the rain, the suitcases, the screaming, the fear, the motel coffee, the lawyer's office, the letter in Edith's handwriting, the house that had looked so perfect from the outside and felt like a locked room on the inside. Then I looked at my children, safe and barefoot and sticky with melted sugar, and I smiled. Yes, I said. It was the best decision of my life. Ellie heard me and climbed into my lap anyway, because 4-year-olds do not care about emotional closure, only warmth. She wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered, "We have a new home now." I held her tighter. "We do!" And that was when I understood the real lesson of everything that had happened. I had not left with only 2 suitcases and 2 children. I had left with the truth. I had left with the part of myself that knew how to survive. I had left with my children before they could learn that love means being diminished. And in the end, the people who tried to take everything from me lost what mattered most. Their money, their pride, their control, their polished image, all the things they thought could never disappear. Meanwhile, I gained something they never understood and never will. Peace. Not the kind that comes from pretending nothing happened. The kind that comes from finally walking away.